That snaps for losers, man. I don't get involved in that stuff, but
Angel Rashad Milligan rolling out.
That's a good question.
Brandon,
We
you want one
can't, we
quick
can't, we
question?
can't ask Rashad questions.
Hey,
Before
Rashad.
we move on to Nasir. Nasir is crazy. Nasty Nas, huh? We found too many slaves. It's so wild. Harvard, shout out to Phil Lewis. Harvard hired a researcher to uncover his ties to slavery. He says the results cost him his job. Quote unquote, we found too many slaves. This is from The Guardian. All right. Harvard hired a researcher to uncover ties to slavery. When the extent of the university's involvement with slavery was unearthed, a scholar tracking descendants of enslaved workers was suddenly fired. This is from Michaela Muskufu. Jordan Lloyd has been praying for something to happen. The 35-year-old screenwriter was quarantining in her apartment in North Hollywood in June 2020. Without any of the projects to fill her days, she picked up the novel Roots by Alex Haley to reread. The novel tells the story of Kunta Kinte, Haley's ancestor, who was captured and sold into slavery in the Gambia and then brought to Virginia, where he is forced onto labor on a plantation. It was adapted into the Emmy Award-winning television series in the 1970s, and while reading it again, Lloyd thought to herself, wouldn't it be nice if we could make another Roots? A few days later, out the blue, she received an email from an undergraduate student at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The email was short. The woman introduced herself as Carissa Chin, a junior at the college studying history. She was working on an independent research project to find descendants of enslaved people connected to the university. By using historical records and modern genealogy tools, she found Lloyd. I have reason to believe through archival research that you could be the descendant of Tony and Cubo Vassal, two slaves from Antigua, by a founding member connected to Harvard University. Oh man, they smart at Harvard, ain't it? The email read, are you available for a call? Anytime for a call. The note linked to a website containing a family tree that Chen had created, tracing the lineage of people enslaved by Isaac Royal Jr., an Antiguan planter and businessman whose endowment would eventually create Harvard Law School. Oh man, Chen hadn't expected to find any living descendants, she told The Guardian, but through dogged research, she managed to uncover 50 names and found Lloyd through an old website she had made when she first moved to Los Angeles. All right, my bad. It all felt too specific to be a scam, Lloyd recounted. So she agreed to call that would eventually blow open everything that she thought she knew about her family history, linking her to one of the nation's most prestigious institutions and launching a phase of her life that would be colored with equal parts of joy and pain. U.S. universities and the legacy of slavery. Though it contradicts a common perception of the colonial New England, enslaved people were brought to work in northern cities in North America as well. In her book of New England Bound, the historian Wendy Warren records the remarks of one European traveler who noted that 1687 that there is not a house in Boston, however small means that it is, that has not been by one or two enslaved people. As the country's oldest and wealthiest university, Harvard's history is inextricable, inexcitable from the history of transatlantic slavery. The enslaved labored in campus buildings, university presidents and professors owned people forced into bondage, and the school's wealth grew from the circles of donors intimately connected to the plantation system in the Caribbean, the American South, and the trafficking of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. Harvard began informally to research its relationship to slavery as early as 2007, when the history professor Seven Beckert started leading undergraduate research seminars such as the one that Chin took. In 2016, then Harvard president Drew Foss acknowledged that the university was directly complicit in slavery, and in 2022, the university released its official report, Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery, which detailed its history over more than 100 pages. Harvard is not only, this is photographs of an enslaved person in the U.S., possibly the oldest known in the country, were discovered in the basement of Harvard University Museum in 1977. Dang, photographed by Bettman Archive. Harvard is not only the only academic institution with this burden. Currently, more than 100 universities across the world are investigating their ties to slavery, the vast majority of which in the U.S. are a small subset of universities researching their ties to slavery. Approximately five have committed to conducting genealogical research and identifying living descendants. Religious denominations such as the Episcopal Church and Evangelical Lutheran Church in more than a dozen cities and 4 states have begun researching their legacies on slavery. The California State Reparations Task Force published a 1,000-page report 2 years ago, and the state legislators have been developing and passing reparations-related initiatives. The Guardian, founded in 1821 in Manchester, England, began its own process in 2020 when its sole owner, the Scott Trust, commissioned independent academic researchers to uncover its links to the transatlantic slavery. It revealed the newspaper's founders, John Edward Taylor, had 9 out of 11 financial backers and had direct ties mainly through Manchester's cotton industry. In 2023, the Scott Trust apologized for its role in its transatlantic slavery and committed its 10-year restorative justice program with millions earmarked for the descendant communities. That year, The Guardian also launched an ongoing series called The Cotton Capital, which explores the legacies of the slavery global. The 2022 Harvard report included a list of recommendations by the Presidential Committee: develop educational partnerships with historically Black colleges and universities, create a public memorial, and perhaps the most continuously identify living descendants of people enslaved by university staff, leaders, and faculty. The announcement was accompanied with a $100 million endowment for implantation. The person of the university tapped to lead the descendant research is a man by the name of Richard Seleny, who had a kind of mythological status in the world of institutional accountability and slavery research. By his own admission, his skill lies primarily in selecting talented researchers and quote unquote keeping them happy. The university, it seemed, was fully committed to beginning the process of discovering an atonement, putting resources together and brain power behind a project that could set the tone for institutions around the country and the world. If successful, Harvard could demonstrate that the truth telling and the reconciliation are possible on a large scale, and that an institutional culture around the silence of historical revisionism can be overturned, and that the light can shine in its deepest cracks. And that will ultimately not be the case, not yet at least. A source of guilt and shame for Harvard. When I visited Seleny and the archives of the Harvard Business School in the mid-February, he was bent over a 19th century ledger book, trained on a set of records with a magnifying glass. He's a trained attorney and tech entrepreneur, and through jovial and quick to joke, he becomes stoic when speaking about his research. In 2015, he started an independent project at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. to locate the descendants of 272 enslaved people sold by Jesuit leaders in the mid 1800s to raise money for the university. Seleny said that he is driven by a sense of moral outrage upon learning about the sale, as well as a curiosity to see what he could find. Along with 10 other researchers, they would eventually locate more than 10,000 direct descendants. Seleny's effort, called the Georgetown Memory Project, remains independent, although the university was given a preferential consideration during the admissions process to descendants and created a quote unquote reconciliation fund for their benefit. In the winter of 2022, before a Harvard report was made public, Seleny said that he was approached by former president of the school, Larry Bacco, and the dean, Tamiko Brown Najin, who asked him if he could do the same thing for Harvard. When he started the research, Harvard had already identified the names of 70 people that had been enslaved with ties to the university. Over the course of the past 3 years, working alongside American ancestors, the country's preeminent genealogical institute, Seleny and his researchers have identified more than 900 people who have been enslaved by university affiliates, faculty, staff, and other people in leadership positions, and nearly 500 of their direct living descendants. Oh my gosh, Harvard. Harvard, Harvard, Harvard. It wasn't long after the work that began to pick up the steam that Seleny started running into trouble. In March 2023, he said that he asked to meet with the project's executive director, Roshana Moore Evans, and Harvard staff members overseeing the initiative. the public health professor, and the vice provost for special projects, Sarah Bleach. These informal meetings that were held in a boardroom in the Student Center, a tall glass building overlooking the gates of Harvard, y'all. It was here and during the extended phone calls that Cellini claims that he was told repeatedly by Bleach was not to find too many descendants. He was told not to find too many descendants. At one point, the fear was expressed that if we found too many descendants, it will bankrupt the university, he said. We're scared. If they find out that we used to be racist, we're going to lose all of our donations. If they found out that we had too many races, we're going to lose all of our donations. Cellini, this is Roberta Roof. Roberta. How can I not say such a simple name? Roberta. Roberta. There we go. Roberta Wolf, a descendant of Tony, Cuba, and Darby Vassal, people enslaved by Harvard benefactors in the institution's first decades on the front porch of her family home in 2022 in Bellingham, Massachusetts. She still lives in Massachusetts. Excuse me. And her descendants were enslaved by Harvard staffers. Look at God. Cellini told Bleach that it was quote unquote ludicrous, he said. Was he supposed to falsify the evidence, to destroy it, to ignore it? I asked for guidance, and the answer was that she didn't know, he said. But we shouldn't report too many descendants. Bleach denied this. The university never issued a directive to him to limit the number of direct descendants that could identify through the work. She told The Guardian during a phone interview. Moore Evans declined to comment on the meetings. In the process of trying to get additional funding for the project, arguing that the amount of work has increased tenfold because of all the additional names that were being uncovered, Cellini met with the finance director of the president's office, Patricia Harrington, this past fall. Harrington wouldn't give a clear answer about the funding request, telling him that, quote unquote, unfortunately, you keep finding more slaves, he said, and that, quote unquote, every new person is a source of guilt and shame for Harvard. We finding these truths to be self-evident that, come on, man. How many history people we got in the chat, bro? What is we talking about right now? Sports Posting for the university said that, quote unquote, any assertion that Patricia Harrington disparaged the work and the legacy of the slavery initiative, including the descendant of research, is false. Even though Cellini was eventually given a budget for 2025, albeit a fraction of what she asked for, the university would soon halt his work entirely. A family's rich history tied to the founding of the U.S. In the early days of discovery were a golden time for Lloyd and her immediate family. Together with Lloyd's father, Dennis and Chin, they would agree to meet over Zoom and swap stories. Her dad was sharing parts of family history that Lloyd had never heard before about his soft-spoken mother and his dad, who owned a flower shop in a neighborhood in Boston called Charlestown. People will open up to a stranger in a way that is more honest and more unfiltered, wanting to go more thorough in a way that you will never go with your family, Lloyd said. Chin, in turn, detailed the findings of her research to Lloyd's, and they began to fill in their histories, tracing connections to the colonial period and the height of the quote-unquote triangular trade. Lloyd's ancestors, 7 generations back, Cuba Vassal, was 3 years old when she was forcibly moved from Antigua to a suburb of Boston, along with her family, by Isaac Royal Jr. in 1737. The Royals were the largest slave-owning family in Massachusetts Bay Colony, owning nearly 70 enslaved people who labored on a 500-acre plantation just north of Boston, as well as controlling more than 100 people on their plantation in Antigua. Before long, Lloyd's ancestors were transferred to another wealthy Cambridge family, the Vassals, for whom they labored in an elaborate Georgian mansion currently known as Longfellow House near the campus of the growing Harvard University. The Vassals owned plantations in Jamaica where more than 1,000 people were enslaved. John Vassal was a Harvard graduate along with his brother Lewis, who once paid the portion of tuition for the large barrel of sugar, one of the more lucrative commodities produced by enslaved people. Cuba's original enslaver, Isaac Royal Jr., didn't have any direct ties to Harvard when he was living, but he endowed a professorship in his will, likely to ensure his legacy that would live on as a member of the colonial elite. The seal of the Harvard Law School was the royal family crest, and until 2016 when students protested to demand its replacement. The royal professorship was retired in 2022. At the Longfellow House, Cuba met with a married man named Tony, originally from Jamaica, who was enslaved by the Vassals. They had 6 children, including Lloyd's ancestor, Darby. During the American Revolutionary War, the royalist vassals fled, and the house was occupied by George Washington, who used the headquarters during his siege of Boston. Excuse me. According to one anecdote, Washington then asked 6-year-old Darby to work for him, who replied he wouldn't work with outrageous. A 6-year-old Darby, and a 6-year-old was like, I ain't gonna work for free. Smart 6-year-olds back in the 1700s, huh? After the war, Tony and Cuba petitioned the state to stay in a small dwelling on the property where they cultivated a piece of land for farming. They had both spent 60 years of their life into slavery, Tony wrote in a 1781 letter, and they, quote unquote, through deprived of what makes them how happy beyond expression, yet they have ever lived the life of honesty and have been faithful in their master's service. The Guardian's style here is making me mad because all punctuation is supposed to go inside the quotation marks. As a side note, he appealed to the court's sense of morality, writing that, quote unquote, they should not be denied of the sweets of the freedom of the remainder of their days by being reduced to the painful necessity of begging for bread. His petition to stay in the house was refused, but Tony was then given an annual pension, one of the earliest examples of a formerly enslaved person receiving compensation. I know that's right. The Isaac Royal House and the slave quarters in Medford, Massachusetts. Dang. Tony's son Darby then went on to become one of the more important figures in burgeoning free black community of Boston. He was an activist throughout his life, supporting the abolitionist movement, becoming a founding member of the African Society of Boston, and adding his name to a state petition to protect black people against the Fugitive Slave Act, along with his daughter and son-in-law. At the end of his life, Darby chose to be buried in the Vassal family tomb underneath Christ Church in Cambridge, which Lloyd and her family went up to visit last June. The tomb was in his basement, and it's in a low-ceilinged crypt locked behind the heavy black metal doors and a couple inches of a curved brick structure peeking above the granite dust floor is the only indication. A dry flower arrangement that Lloyd left is still there. A tidy pile of lavender, white, Christamum, and clover. Hold on. Chrysanthemum? Hold on. Give me a second. We on here. How you say this? Oh, no.
Chrysanthemum.
Chrysanthemum. All right. Chrysanthemum. A white chrysanthemum and clover. Making these connections and being able to visit her ancestor's grave brought Lloyd a deep sense of, quote unquote, internal certainty and peace and comfort and groundedness, she said. Quote unquote, I will want that for everyone whose family is somehow affiliated, yet the joy and excitement comes with a deep sadness. Why hasn't this been resolved? She wondered aloud during the interview phone call. Why did no one else in my family know? Lloyd's only contact from the administration, she said, was a quote unquote icy interaction with Brown Nation during a group call. And then she said she heard nothing since. Naively, I was expecting them to be very welcoming and excited to facilitate discussion, she said. I was hoping that they would be warmer, more open to reconcile the long history. The university says that it has not began the outreach process. Since the initiative was announced, the university has been given more than $4 million in grants to local organizations and built up partnerships with historically black colleges and universities that hold on. Okay, such as the Boys Scholars Program. This is by far the hardest job that I've had, Bleach, who oversees the Harvard Legacy of Slavery Institute, said. We are very serious about this, and we are very sincere. Firings, resignations, and attempt to dilute and delay research. In late January, as he was pulling his car into the parking lot of Harvard Business School, prepared to begin another day of research in the university archives, Selene received a call from an HR person who said he and his team were fired effective immediately. He was never given an explanation, he said, and a university spokesperson told The Guardian that, quote unquote, we cannot comment on personnel matters. The genealogy research and the university announced that after Selene's firing, firing would be continued through the quote unquote expanded partnership with American Ancestors, the genealogy nonprofit that had already been working closely with Cellini's team. Quote unquote, they are the world's best genealogists, Cellini said, based on his team's research in the Harvard archives, identifying school leaders, faculty, or staff who owned enslaved people and the names of people they enslaved. American Ancestors would then search downstream, or as Cellini put it, for living descendants. In this new agreement, the organization has taken over in all aspects of research. The initiative received its first public blow last spring when two university professors on the committee to create the memorial stepped down, staying in an open letter that the university had attempted to quote unquote dilute and delay their efforts. Come on now, let's run this back. Two professors on the committee to create a memorial stepped down, saying in an open letter that the university had attempted to dilute and delay their efforts in reaching out to descendants. The committee was formed in 2023 based on one of the recommendations of the Harvard and Legacy of Slavery report to quote unquote honor enslaved people through memorialization. In a statement made to the student newspaper, a spokesperson for the university said that it quote unquote takes seriously as the co-chair's concerns about the importance of community involvement and taking of steps that will enable Harvard to deeply engage in descendant communities. A couple of weeks later, the executive director of the initiative, Moore Evans, stepped down after reporting conflicts with the university administration to HR. She told The Guardian that she left, quote unquote, for personal reasons. This is the grave of Cecilia, a 15-year-old Negro servant of the Reverend William R. Brattle, a treasurer at Harvard College. Wow. At an old burying ground just outside the Harvard Yard on the 27th of April, 2022 in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Here lies the body of Cecily, a Negro late servant to the Reverend William Brattle. She had died April 7th, 1714, being 15 years old. Jeez Louise. Cellini suspects the reason that he was fired is simple. We found too many slaves. Wow. The university was afraid that identifying descendants will bankrupt the university with so much each name of his team identified as quote unquote expensive, he said. The work he oversaw was quote unquote just the tip of the iceberg. Wow. He added, estimating that the numbers of the living descendants could be about 10,000 people. Jeez Louise. Cellini had to come back from Antigua just a couple days prior, where his team had visited on the site of the Royal Plantation, as well as 4 other plantations with ties to the university. They also found 100 additional names of enslaved people with ties to the university in public archives, he said. Cellini and his team met with the Prime Minister and the Governor of Antigua, who expressed interest in working with the university to explore this connection. Cellini said that he detailed his meetings with the politicians to the university, but those requests were never answered. He was fired shortly after. The Antiguan ambassador to the U.S., Sir Ronald Sanders, wrote in a letter to the university after learning that Cellini was fired, writing that the decision was made, quote unquote, without consultation or notification. The country wants, quote unquote, real engagement and meaningful action that befits the benefits that Harvard derived, he wrote, quote unquote. We would not expect the cash payment from Harvard, a spokesperson added, quote unquote. However, so well endowed a university with expertise in a number of areas can be helpful to our country. The cabinet discussed the possibility of Harvard funding ancestry research to identify descendants of Antiguans that were brought to the colonial Massachusetts and seeking the university's assistance in public health matters to address the high rates of chronic illness on the islands. A spokesperson for Harvard said in a letter had been sent in response but refused to elaborate. The spokesperson for Antigua said, quote unquote, I have not had a response and cannot confirm if a response had been received. A life spent and exhausted for the production of sugarcane. The Royal Plantation, which likely stretched across 200 acres down to the Port Royal Bay, enslaved more than 100 people. Only the ruins of sugar mill remain on the private property. The stone structure stands for 100 feet tall on a grassy field bordering some woods. Here, enslaved people lived and worked on a plantation, feeding sugarcane until metal rollers through dangerous and physically exhausting process to make syrup. It's pretty visceral, Cellini said about Vigilant Sight. This is where lives were spent and exhausted and consumed for the production of sugarcane for the wealth of the British Empire. The Isaac Royal House and slave quarters at Medford, Massachusetts. Ever since being contacted by Chen, Lloyd felt that the weight of her family history and the sense of responsibility. Her ancestors repeatedly petitioned for their freedom, for their rights of humanity. Darby and his sister Flora had both been separated from their families by enslavers as young children. Tony Vassal brought his daughter's freedom when his enslaver died by injury sustained at the Battle of Bunker Hill. 6-year-old Darby walked 10 miles, home to his family. The family had been staunch abolitionists and activists, suffered through the bondage, and fought for their freedom. Lloyd struggles with where that leaves her. I just don't know where to begin, quote unquote, Lloyd said. She considers taking social media, calling the administration and making demands. Should she protest? She doesn't know. Lloyd's sister, who declined to be interviewed for this article, went to Antigua, and Lloyd said that she's also interested in going. I would go anywhere to talk to anyone at this point, she said, except for Harvard, because there's no one there that I really trust right now. Quote unquote, I feel like I'm close to explosion, she said. My eyes are still ringing. My ears are still ringing. This article was amended for June 21st, 2025. John Vassal was a Harvard graduate, not John Everett Taylor, as the story originally said. Man, first of all, this is what journalism's all about. Amazing story. Who wrote this? Michaela Muscofo. Amazing. Sensational story. Second of all, once again, I feel like something that I'm constantly, hammering down the importance on this channel for like the past few months is the current Trump administration, and not even just the current Trump administration, but I feel like the Republican Party in large for the past decade or so have made a conservative effort of taking out a lot of history out of the history books. And it was already, as is, so much not being taught to the kids, so much that I wasn't taught into college when I like was kind of minoring in African American studies and things of that sort. No. I was minoring in theater, but I took a lot of African American studies classes in college. And it was stuff that I was like, dang, like, why did we never learn this 13 years of grade school, bro? Like, we never learned any of this stuff. And it was just so much. And that was just the tip of the iceberg because they were just, semester long courses. And things like this, it all comes back to this. What did Harvard say? They said they felt ashamed. They said they felt scared. They said they were going to lose their money if people just found out how many of them were attached to slaves and descendants of slaves, slave owners, and things of that sort. And your history and the books and reading and learning your history, the curriculum is so powerful. It's so powerful. That's why they don't want you to know any of it. And so it's important that you do go out of your way and you do learn it while the books are still around, because they're going to get rid of the books. They're going to get rid of a lot of the information on online archives. They're just going to disappear one by one. They're going to be scrubbed. The records are going to be scrubbed. And, that's just kind of where it's going, because it's considered quote unquote woke curriculum, and their justification for it is that it incites and kind of encourages a divisive society. Society is going to be divisive regardless, so you might as well teach them the truth about why people think a certain way or move a certain way, because there is a history of this stuff, hence the word history. And the patterns, there's nothing new under the sun. Everything that happens now has happened before. And if people can understand that, they can understand life more, and they can understand modern society more, and civilization, et cetera, et cetera. You take that away from the schools, you take that away from the general public to consume, and you have a lost generation, bro. And you have people who think that LeBron James is the greatest player of all time. Hey, it's easy. My name is Rashad Milligan, man. I hope you guys enjoy the stream, man. W stream. We will be back tomorrow because I'm live every single day. I hope you had a good morning. Have a good afternoon. Have a good evening. Have a good night. Have a good day whenever you're watching this. And if nobody else told you today, I care for you. I will see you tomorrow because I stream every single day. Peace.
Steps for losers, man. I don't get involved in that stuff, but
Angel Rashad Milligan rolling out.
That's a good question. Brandon,
Yeah,
you
we
got one
can't
quick question?
ask Rashad questions.
Hey, Rashad.